Just yesterday, I was at this flea market and I was digging for records. And I found a copy of You Can't Hurry Love, a 12-inch single from Phil Collins. Now, I don't love the song You Can't Hurry Love. I mean, it's a good song. I don't really love Phil's cover. I think he did a great job covering it, but it's just not one of my favorite Phil Collins songs. I think it kind of stands out from his catalog. I'm not a huge fan, but I'm a completist. And lately I've been collecting these 12-inch singles, and I saw it there for a good price for $5 in great condition, so I had to buy it. So a couple minutes later, I'm a few booths down looking for more records, and I find another booth with records in it. So I asked my wife to hold my copy of You Can't Hurry Love so I could be free to dig through the records. A few minutes into digging through the records in this booth, the owner of the booth comes up to me, and at this point my wife is 15 feet away and he doesn't know that she's with me. He sees that copy of You Can't Hurry Love and he starts to talk to me about it. He says, "What a terrible song. What a terrible cover. I hate Phil Collins. Why did he do that Motown cover? He ruined Genesis." I mean, he's going on and on about everything he hates about Phil Collins. He said he was a great drummer, but he's talking about Peter, he's talking about Steve, but he just keeps tearing apart Phil Collins. And I'm seething. I mean, I'm digging through the records, but I'm seething. So you know what I did? I set his booth on fire, burned everything down, and I stabbed him with a broken copy of We Can't Dance. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Everything Phil Collins. I'm your host, Scott. We're going to try to tackle the question, did Phil Collins ruin Genesis? Well, I'm going to give you a little spoiler. No, he didn't. And I've got 5 reasons that I want to talk about today. 5 reasons, 5 arguments as why I think that Phil Collins is unduly criticized for ruining Genesis. I don't think he ruined Genesis. Most people don't think he ruined Genesis, but I've got 5 arguments for that. Now, this flea market story really did just happen, and I couldn't believe it.
So get this, as much as I wanted to strangle this guy who was speaking ill of Phil Collins, he actually had this and totally redeemed himself. This is a Genesis bootleg from 1973, the last show in the US on the Selling England by the Pound tour. It's a double disc. It was $50. It's a rare find. And so he kind of saved himself with having this record.
But I think there's a lot of people who don't know the whole picture. And of course, we know there's people who aren't fans of Phil Collins for whatever reason. And this guy seemed to think he ruined Genesis. Okay, let's go to reason number 1. Remember that everybody else left Genesis, except for Phil, Mike, and Tony. Now, Phil eventually. But the point is that I always feel like the guys who left the band, especially when it was at the peak, the guys who left the band are usually the ones that don't get the criticism. It's the ones that remain and that change the sound. But guys like Peter, who left at arguably the peak of Genesis at Selling England by the Pound and The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and then he leaves. Why doesn't he get any criticism for abandoning the band at such a height like that? Now, of course, we know it's personal reasons. The same thing for Anthony Phillips. And Steve decided to go on and do his own thing, maybe thought that the band had plateaued after Wind. But my issue is that it's the guys who remain that bear the criticism of what they did afterwards. And I always just find that kind of interesting because we hold up Steve in such great esteem and we hold up Peter in such great esteem, as we should, but they're the ones that left. And I always just find that kind of interesting. It's that the guys that remain who get criticized.
You know when your dad cheats on your mom and then your parents split up, but the kids end up blaming the mom for some reason?
Number 2 is that it was obvious that everyone evolved their style as they ushered into the 80s. And of course, a lot of the criticism towards Genesis is that they moved away from that prog sound and even that folksier sound that you would hear on Foxtrot and Selling England, that they moved away from that into synthesizers, into drum machines, and into more of a pop sound, and eventually just doing straight up pop ballads like In Too Deep or Hold On My Heart. I understand that criticism. I understand the dichotomy of sound for sure. That could be very jarring, especially if you're following along a band. I imagine it's similar to Coldplay. You hear this, beautiful artsy acoustic album in Parachutes, and then 20 years later, you hear them doing pop duets with K-pop bands. So I understand how jarring that difference can be. But it happened across the board. It happened with Tony was doing that kind of music, and Mike was doing that kind of music. Peter, of course, was doing that kind of music. Sledgehammer and Invisible Touch separated each other from the #1 slot on Billboard just 1 week apart. Now, some people would argue that the 80s music of Peter Gabriel was a little bit more art pop, whereas the 80s music of some of Genesis and Phil Collins stuff was more commercially pop. But I think that's people just being biased towards Peter. But my point is that everyone was evolving their sound at that time. So to say that if Genesis with Peter and Steve in the 80s, would they have still have sounded like Selling England by the Pound, or would they have sounded more like Abacab or Invisible Touch? I think it's pretty obvious that they would have all evolved their sound, especially if some of those aggressive synthesizers were coming from Tony. If you listen to Peter stuff, if you listen to Steve stuff, you listen to Mike and the Mechanics, you just hear 80s sounds all throughout their career. You could take a playlist of some of Steve's stuff from 1986, 1983, 1981, some of those albums. You could make a playlist with some of Peter Gabriel's stuff from the So era and Shock the Monkey, and you could take Mike and the Mechanics, and you could take Phil Collins and Genesis, and it would sound like a continual 80s, classic 80s rock or 80s pop sound. So I really don't subscribe to this concept that Genesis would have maintained this 1970s sound for the next 30 years, had Peter and Steve and even Anthony stayed in the band. Number 3 is, if you dig into the history of Genesis, you realize that they always wanted to be songwriters. They came into this in the 1960s whenever they had just come out of the Tin Pan Alley and the big, in the Motown era of songwriters and the Brill Building songwriters. And so these are young guys who maybe didn't see themselves as rock stars or as Beatles. And so they thought, hey, we could just be songwriters for pop artists, something like the Bee Gees became and something like Carole King became. So I think like criticizing them for evolving into eventually becoming hit writers and a lot of them making it onto the charts and even having #1 songs, that kind of was always the goal all the way back into high school. And so I think that's kind of something we need to remember, is that people like Mike and Tony set out to be songwriters, to make money writing songs. So I don't think there was ever this like commitment to stay avant-garde and to stay independent and not to sell out. Number 4 is the importance to look at the collateral effect that happened on everybody in the Phil Collins and Genesis realm. And I really think that the success of Genesis in the 80s and the success of Phil Collins in the 80s brought up everything. It was like, what do they say? Rising tide raises all boats? I don't know. There's this idea that it kind of elevated everyone, all of the boats at once. And I think that's why, to a certain extent, I think that the success that Steve Hackett is still having today would have to do with the rise of Genesis in the 80s and the rise of Phil Collins in the 80s. I think the same thing could almost be said of Peter Gabriel. I mean, what we know to be true is that you could have a fan of Phil Collins who can't get enough, gets into the 80s Genesis Phil Collins, then digs a little bit deeper into the 70s of Genesis, and then wants more and goes into the Peter Gabriel stuff and goes into the Anthony Phillips and Mike and the Mechanics and Tony Banks and Steve Hackett. And so I think it's kind of important to acknowledge that because Genesis became one of the biggest bands in the world, that the collateral was that everybody benefited from it and everybody is still benefiting from it. I think that may get overlooked. And I wonder if we didn't have the rise of Face Value and the rise of No Jacket Required and Hello, I Must Be Going, and that maybe led into the rise of Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance. If we didn't have that, what would Genesis look like today? In fact, one of the things that I feel like, going back to my first point, is one of the things I feel like doesn't get discussed as much is there's a possibility that Genesis could have ended after The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And I know for a lot of people, they would have been okay with that, but I'm not sure that we would be having this conversation today if that happened. If there was no Phil Collins solo career, if they didn't continue on with A Trick of the Tail and all the way through to Duke and Invisible Touch, if they didn't become the biggest band in the world, and if Phil didn't become the biggest solo artist in the world for a time, then I'm just not sure that we would be having this conversation. I don't think this YouTube channel would exist. I think that Genesis would be this underground cult phenomenon that placed in the 70s and that ended abruptly at the height of this avant-garde double album. I think it would be known by some music fans, some deep prog music fans as the Genesis of prog, if you will. I just don't think they would have made it into the mainstream in any sense of the word. I don't think there would be a YouTube channel. I don't even think that the lore around Genesis and the big tours that we see and all of the subreddits and the Discord channels around Genesis today and the podcasts, I just don't think that would exist if everything ended at The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So I am an apologist for Phil Collins. I'm a defender of Phil Collins. And I think because he took over vocals, not because he took over vocals, but thankfully he took over vocals so that we could still, new generations could learn who Genesis is, could come into Genesis at Trick of the Tail, could come into the Genesis era in Abacab or in Duke or Invisible Touch or even We Can't Dance, and then to gradually explore that back catalog. So in a way, Phil Collins didn't ruin Genesis, he saved Genesis. And finally, here's what we know to be true, and I think Phil has said this himself. Phil was never in control of the band. There was no ousting of Peter. Phil was very happy at the back. In fact, when Peter left, he suggested they become an instrumental band, which is crazy to think of. Had they become an instrumental band, none of them would be millionaires or billionaires. They would probably be working second jobs now and still playing pubs. But Phil has said this. Anybody who knows the dynamics of the band, Phil was never in charge. It was essentially Tony Banks, let's be honest. Tony and Mike were the only original members, and so they controlled the band, and that's why they kept going when Phil left. And that's why they evolved the sound into a darker 90s grunge sound and calling all stations. But we know that Phil was in control of his own domain, but he was never in full control of the band. Now, did his success influence Genesis? Did they think, oh, well, Phil has success with horns, so why don't we try horns? Oh, Phil has some success with pop ballads, why don't we try pop ballads? Sure. We know that the confidence of Phil's songwriting increased, and therefore he wrote more for the band. We know that to be true. But Phil could have never have driven the ship where Tony and Mike didn't want it to go. And so this concept that Phil was pushing the band into that pop world, we see that because he has confidence on stage, but we know behind the scenes that that's not true. We've seen the interviews with Mike and Tony and Phil. We've heard that. We even know that the dynamic issue with Peter and Tony is one of the reasons why Peter left. And one of the reasons why Phil had such a good time doing his own thing is because he could explore things. He could do behind the lines the way he wanted it to. He could be free. And I think having his solo career and having Genesis allowed him to have the best of both worlds, where he was in total control of his solo career, but then he was part of a band in the traditional sense with Genesis. Those are my 5 reasons of why I don't think that Phil Collins ruined Genesis. Do you think that Phil Collins ruined Genesis? Let me know in the comments below.